Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're going to unpack a genuinely fascinating mystery. And it's all based on a highly detailed, really eye-opening analysis from the Financial Times. For decades, the United States has stood pretty uncontested as the global military, economic, and financial hegemon. But right now, a very serious question is bubbling to the surface among top economists and historians. And that question is the United States finally spending itself into imperial collapse? Are we actually watching the financial breaking point of a superpower? Today we're going to break down the hard numbers, the shifting global tides, and some wild historical precedents to figure out exactly what is happening to the empire of American debt. Let's get into it. Okay, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The imperial overstretch question. 2. Funding the ghost budget. 3. The structural deficit reality. 4. Losing exorbitant privilege. And finally, 5. Echoes of fallen empires. All right, let's dive right into Section 1, the imperial overstretch question. To really wrap our heads around what's happening today, we actually need to rewind over 2,000 years to the ancient historian Thucydides. He argued that dominant powers, like Athens back in his day, ultimately decline when the financial and military costs of maintaining their external security just flat out exceed what their domestic economy can actually produce. That right there is the essence of imperial overstretch. And what makes this ancient concept so compelling right now is how incredibly relevant it feels. According to the Financial Times, when President Donald Trump visited Xi Jinping in Beijing, the Chinese president pointedly brought up this exact concept. Xi actually asked outright if the US and China can overcome this trap. It was a very clear signal that rival powers are watching the costs of American primacy very, very closely. And honestly, you can see exactly why they're watching. Just consider the national defense budget request that President Trump submitted for the year 2027. It totals a truly staggering $1.5 trillion. To put that into perspective for a second, that number completely doubles the defense budget figure from 2020. That is a massive, breakneck acceleration in the cost of projecting global power. And the wildest part? The Financial Times notes that this $1.5 trillion figure doesn't even include the potential costs of any new wars of choice. Or just consider the current burn rate of active conflicts. The ongoing conflict in Iran is currently racking up an estimated $2 billion in short-term direct costs, and that is every single day. When you're spending $2 billion a day on a localized conflict, it becomes pretty clear how the financial burden of modern military primacy can accumulate with terrifying speed. Which brings us to Section 2, funding the ghost budget. So you might be wondering, how on earth is all of this actually being paid for? Well, it represents a massive, fundamental shift in American policy. Back in 1951, during the Korean War, President Harry Truman implemented what he called a tax-as-we-go policy. He explicitly argued against borrowing money to fund the war, warning that it would just pass a massive burden down to our children and spark inflation. So they just taxed current income to pay for it up front. But look at the post-9/11 era. That restraint is completely gone. For the first time since the American Revolutionary War, these massive, sprawling conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the wider region have been paid for almost entirely by debt. And this shift brings us to a really fascinating concept identified by Linda Bilmes over at the Harvard Kennedy School. She calls it the ghost budget. Basically, instead of raising taxes and making the public feel the immediate financial pain of going to war, the U.S. started using emergency appropriations. They integrated private sector contractors into core military activities, and they relied on some pretty poor accounting practices to conceal the true expenses. The end result? We see much lower civic engagement, way less accountability for war spending, and ultimately prolonged conflicts. The sheer financial weight of these engagements is essentially hidden right out of view from the everyday public. But, when researchers actually sit down and do the math, the numbers are just jaw-dropping. The Brown University Costs of War Project estimates that the total budgetary costs and future obligations of the post-9/11 wars sit at roughly $8 trillion, and that's in 2021 dollars. Now, that does include future costs for veterans' care, but here's the kicker. It completely excludes any future interest costs on the debt used to finance the whole thing. It is just a monumental figure, and it's the kind of number that fundamentally changes the economic trajectory of a whole nation. Moving on to Section 3, the structural deficit reality. Okay, so here is the stark, unavoidable reality we're facing today. The total U.S. government debt held by the public and federal agencies now sits at an astounding $36 trillion. The ratio of U.S. public debt to GDP is climbing right back to the extreme highs we only previously saw right after World War II. But unlike in 1946, there is no peace dividend waiting for us on the horizon. And because of this massive, towering debt pile, the U.S. Treasury's interest bill alone has ballooned from 1.5% of GDP back in 2021 to over 3% today. It is, quite frankly, fiscal incontinence on a very grand scale. And the Financial Times analysis makes a really crucial point here. This isn't just a recent fluke. It's actually a structural bias built right into modern U.S. politics. When we look back at the historical timeline, the last time the U.S. actually ran a budget surplus was way back under Democratic President Bill Clinton between 1998 and 2001. But that budget quickly swung right back into a deficit under his successor, George W. Bush, driven in large part by the massive costs of the Iraq War. Fast forward to today, and the deficit is running at nearly 6% of GDP. And due to intense polarized political gridlock, neither party seems willing or able to rein it in. This quote from Alan Auerbach, an economist at UC Berkeley, absolutely hits the nail on the head when describing the domestic trap the U.S. is stuck in. He says, "The key to fiscal consolidation is bipartisan agreement. Neither party can then blame the other for short-term outcomes voters may not like." It makes total sense, right? Without bipartisanship, there is simply no fix, because neither side wants to take the political hit. And this gridlock leads directly to increasing external imbalances and really crowds out productive economic investment at home. Which takes us to Section 4, losing exorbitant privilege. So, historically, the U.S. has actually been shielded from the worst consequences of its massive debt by something coined back in the 1960s as exorbitant privilege. This basically refers to the incredible advantage the U.S. enjoys because the dollar is the world's primary reserve currency, and the U.S. Treasury market is seen as the ultimate global safe haven. For decades, this status has guaranteed the U.S. government constant, incredibly easy access to international capital, along with unbelievably low borrowing costs. Honestly, it's basically a superpower cheat code for economics. Now, what's truly wild about the current data is how the world's central banks are actively changing their behavior. According to the European Central Bank, central banks have traditionally just bought up U.S. debt, but lately, they are unwinding their dollar reserves. In a pretty shocking shift, gold has actually replaced U.S. Treasuries as the world's top reserve asset. Bullion now accounts for 27% of global central bank reserve assets, while U.S. Treasuries have slipped down to 22%. The global appetite for American debt is, without a doubt, actively eroding. So if the world's central banks are backing away, who is actually buying all this debt? Well, increasingly, it's non-bank institutions, specifically hedge funds. But as the former Bank for International Settlements chief economist William White warns, this creates a deeply dangerous doom loop. Here's how it works. Step 1. Hedge funds buy up treasuries using highly leveraged short-term repo loans. Step 2. A sudden market disturbance or a geopolitical shock interrupts their access to that short-term financing. And step 3, an intense systemic deleveraging spiral kicks off, potentially crashing the whole market. We are literally relying on fragile hedge funds to prop up the empire's debt. In fact, the financial think tank Group of 30 refers to this specific combination of risks as a witch's brew for global financial instability. The ingredients going into this cauldron? You've got the breakneck growth of these non-bank financial actors, the reversal of post-2008 regulatory reforms, the relentless rise in public debt, and, of course, increasing geopolitical fragmentation. And as top economists keep pointing out, these warning signs are multiplying fast, and the window to actually take preventative action is rapidly narrowing. If a major crisis does hit, the ultimate nightmare scenario is something called fiscal dominance. This happens when a central bank is totally paralyzed. They literally cannot raise interest rates to fight off inflation, because doing so would make the interest payments on the country's massive public debt absolutely crushing. Price stability just gets sacrificed simply to keep the government solvent. Experts warn this could trigger a stagflationary world, potentially even splitting the global economy right down the middle into a dollar-based bloc and a gold-backed renminbi-based bloc. And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, Echoes of Fallen Empires. UC Berkeley professor Barry Eichengreen draws this super fascinating, though honestly pretty sobering, parallel to the Roman Empire. He compares modern U.S. currency and debt policies to those of Emperor Nero. Back in the day, to finance costly wars on multiple fronts, alongside massive domestic infrastructure projects like canals and, oh yeah, an extravagant 300-room palace, because, let's face it, a 300-room palace certainly doesn't pay for itself, Nero resorted to debasing the Roman denarius by reducing its silver content. It was a textbook case of imperial overstretch, and it truly marked the beginning of the long, protracted erosion of Rome's economic and military primacy. And the thing is, we see this exact pattern repeating itself throughout history. France's Sun King, Louis XIV, was famous for his warmongering and sheer financial profligacy. On his deathbed, he offered this incredibly powerful, tragic apology, admitting that he had loved war too much and spent too much. It serves as a heavy emotional anchor for us today, demonstrating the relentless historical toll of imperial overstretch. It's a toll that's always measured in massive debt, national exhaustion, and ultimately decline. So, based on all of this, the Financial Times analysis leaves us with one incredibly provocative final thought. As the United States navigates intense polarized politics, staggering structural deficits, and the genuinely massive financial burdens of modern conflict, we have to ask, will the defining legacy of this era be the empire of debt that finally undermined American power? The historical precedents are crystal clear, and the financial warning signs are absolutely flashing red. It's a crucial question for the future of the entire global order, and I highly encourage you all to keep digging into this fascinating dynamic. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you in the next one.